A distinctive aspect of Spanish medieval culture were the relations between Christians, Jews, and Muslims. The nature of those relations was marked by intellectual and cultural exchange, suppression, and violence. And those are represented in the images that we have here. First, from 950, the scene from Revelation of Christ returning with the book of life, surrounded by angels and the people below. This is a Mozarabic image, the Mozarabs being those Christians who lived under Muslim rule and spoke Arabic. Here we have the great mosque at Cordoba, which became a Christian church, as many mosques were turned into churches after the Reconquest. And from the 13th century, a famous image of a Jew and a Muslim playing chess. So this notion of exchange, yet at the same time hostility and suppression. So we pose the question, how did Christians, Muslims, and Jews live together in Spain? The interpretations of historians vary considerably. And some historians have written of a culture of convivencia, of living together. They suggest that the three religions lived in a remarkable harmony. In many ways, it's a rather idealized representation of what happened, of toleration and cooperation. But there's no doubt that there was considerable interaction on all levels of society. Intellectual, at the court, and intermarriage. We should, however, guard against becoming too enamored with the idea that in Spain, relations between Christians, Jews, and Muslims were distinctively harmonious. First of all, we need to remember that that relationship was to be found in other areas, such as in Norman Sicily, or in Syria and Palestine. In all those places, we can find examples of the three religions living in degree of peace. In Spain, however, on the whole, a culture of hostility remained. With the reconquest by Christians in the 12th and 13th century, Muslims who were in Christian lands who chose to remain, known as the Mutihar, were vulnerable to massacre by marauding Christian troops. Mosques, as we've seen here, were frequently either destroyed or turned into churches. Muslims became slaves for Christians. Medieval Spain remained a slave-owning culture after it had disappeared from most other parts of Europe. Many Muslims were expelled, forced to leave, such as where they were in Seville in 1248. The Mujahirs, who lived under Christian rule, suffered in a variety of ways, but as we shall see, provision was made for them. Just as the Christians who had lived under Muslim rule, who were known as the Mozarabic Church, had been allowed to exist with certain regulations. The rules of how the Mujahidar were to live were set out in what was known as the fueros. They could live under Muslim law, and they had a degree of freedom of worship, but they had to pay annual dues to the crown. Documents bear witness to the tension that existed in the areas where Muslims and Christians lived. Muslims, on the one hand, had no say in the government, And it was not uncommon for them to be walled in, separated from Christians. And there was freedom of worship, as I say. But for example, in many areas, Muslims were forced to abstain from work on the Sabbath. And many Muslims and Jews were forced to bow before priests. As I've said, many of the great mosques were turned into churches. And for Christians, it was punishable by death for them to convert to Islam. Muslims were by no means permitted to proselytize. Although we do know that some Jews and Muslims did convert to Christianity. There were incentives for them to do so, particularly in the case of Muslims. They were offered in freedom from slavery. The effect of these conversions on Muslim culture was considerable. And what went alongside that was that under Christian rule, the language that they had spoken, Arabic, began to disappear, although Arabic would leave a strong mark on the vernacular with many loan words. The Christian conquerors of Andalusia in the 12th and 13th century treated the Muslims with both toleration and persecution. There was indeed real living together amongst the faiths, and that led to extraordinary achievements. As scholars have pointed out, how else would Jewish culture have adopted Greek, Arabic philosophy, science, and medicine, which would lead to the great figure of Maimonides, about whom we shall speak, and others? The study of Hebrew grammar was greatly influenced by the work of Muslim scholars on Arabic. We also know that at Muslim courts, both Christians and Jews could hold high office. The Muslim rulers did not envisage forceful conversions to their religion. They were not interested in that, which is distinctive from what the Christians would do. Their relationship to Judaism was somewhat different than to Christianity. In many ways, it was better, because for Muslims there was a deep suspicion of the Christian doctrine of the Trinity, which they saw as opposed to true monotheism. Likewise, the hostility of Christians towards Jews, which was through a Christological or a reading of Christ into the Jewish scriptures, led to a hostility that we will have time to speak about later. Convivencia, a living together, was possible from the Arabic period in Spanish culture, when Muslims, Jews, and Christians did find ways, usually in local circumstances, to have cultural exchange and coexistence. But we should not idealize this. There was conflict and death. And this would only grow towards the end of the 14th century with pogroms and the growth of Catholic Spain, which would lead to the Inquisition.